As she had approached the window with cautious eagerness, her eyes had fallen upon Kendrick Eckhart, who had been standing below in the garden. From her position, it had seemed as though the conversation he had been engaged in had already ended. A perfect opportunity to fly away had presented itself. Her wings had trembled with anticipation. Freedom had been within her reach. But just as the moment of departure had arrived, the door had creaked open unexpectedly. The sudden intrusion had startled her. Adele, the young maid, had entered the room with a soft smile and a tray in her hands. It had been mentioned by her that some cookies had been brought from the kitchen. Linshur had been instantly filled with panic. The timing had seemed far too soon. A dreadful thought had crossed her mind: what if her absence had already been noticed? The tray had been placed down gently, and a glance around the room had been given by Adele. A question had then been asked by her: where had the young miss gone? Linshur, still in her transformed bird form, had frozen in place. The consequences of being discovered had flashed vividly in her mind. All her plans could be destroyed in an instant. A quick moment of eye contact had been exchanged between Linshur and Adele. But by then, Linshur had already taken a leap of faith. Through the window, her small form had soared into the open sky. A sense of exhilaration had rushed through her. It had been thought by her that the transformation had truly succeeded. But soon enough, a realization had dawned: her wings were still underdeveloped. The imbalance had caused her to tilt slightly to one side as she flew. The note she had held tightly in her beak had begun to slip, threatening to fall. Still, her mind had remained focused. An escape had been made. Now, the only goal that remained was to reach the leader of the wolf clan. From her place in the air, the figure of the person she had been looking for had been spotted. She had been close, almost there. However, a problem had suddenly made itself known. No method for landing had ever been learned by her. A controlled descent had not been practiced. In an instant, her body had crashed straight into the outstretched hand of Kendrick Eckhart. A moment of confusion had followed. Linshur had tried to understand whether she had landed properly or merely collided with something. But as her senses had adjusted, the realization had come to her: she had ended up in Kendrick's hand. Her feathers had been examined closely by him, and it had been observed that she bore the marks of the Raniero family. A question had been raised by him, wondering why a bird with such noble markings had been playing alone in the garden. Relief had swept through Linshur's thoughts. Despite the rough landing, a safe arrival had been achieved. All that remained now was to deliver the note clutched between her beak. A remark had then been made by Kendrick. Her ability to transform at such a young age had been found impressive. But it had also been suggested that someone so small should remain with the servants when moving about the garden. It had not been what Linshur had wanted to hear. She had been gently placed on the ground as Kendrick prepared to leave. But Linshur had not been willing to let him go. With renewed determination, she had jumped onto his shoulder, signaling urgently. There had been something of great importance that needed to be conveyed. A scratch had been delivered to his finger. Before he could even question the reason behind it, her ability had been activated. In moments, the wound had disappeared. Full healing had been completed. Shock had filled Kendrick's face as the full extent of her power had been witnessed. But the moment had been interrupted. Voices had echoed in the distance. Servants had been seen searching, and fear had gripped Linshur. It had been feared that her disappearance had already been discovered. Immediate hiding had been needed. Without hesitation, Kendrick had covered her gently with his hand. Though uncertainty had remained in his tone, agreement had finally been given. He had acknowledged that while her intentions were not fully understood, she would be taken along with him. And so, a step toward freedom had been taken, together. From the Grand Raniero estate, a group of soldiers had been dispatched with a single purpose: to locate the elusive young woman who had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Their search had brought them to the outskirts of the territory, where they had encountered Kendrick standing silently near the road. His expression had remained unreadable, and his posture unthreatening. No suspicion had been directed toward him, and after a fleeting glance, the soldiers had turned away and continued on their way, unaware of the secret that had been tucked away within the folds of his coat. Unseen by those who passed, Linshur, still trapped within the delicate form of a small bird, had remained hidden inside Kendrick's coat. Relief had been felt by her as the soldiers moved away, their footsteps fading into the distance. Her thoughts had been filled with quiet triumph. It had been believed by her that she had escaped capture. The servants of Rhaenyra had failed to discover her, and now all that remained was to continue her careful concealment and follow Kendrick until she reached the mansion of the wolves. Still, despite her momentary relief, the small space within the coat had begun to feel increasingly stifling. The warmth of the fabric, although comforting at first, had quickly become oppressive. Her tiny chest had risen and fallen rapidly as the closeness of the pocket pressed against her feathers. It had been thought by her that Kendrick's pocket, while surprisingly spacious and lined with a soft material, could no longer serve as a safe haven for her restless spirit. The real burden lay not in the tightness of the coat, but in the memories that had begun to flood her mind once more. As Kendrick walked toward his waiting carriage, Lyncher had been transported back to a moment that haunted her deeply. Her thoughts had drifted to a day engulfed by fire and blood, a day where screams had filled the sky and chaos had ruled the land. Smoke had risen from every direction, thick and choking, painting the air in a haze of fear. The sharp, metallic stench of blood had been overwhelming, and wolves, merciless and relentless, had prowled through the flames, their howls a chilling reminder that she had been hunted like prey. Each breath drawn within that pocket had made it feel as though she had returned to that firestorm. Her wings had trembled. Her heart had pounded. Panic had begun to set in once again. Unable to contain the rising pressure within her chest, Lyncher had pushed her feathered head out from Kendrick's coat. A deep breath of fresh air had been drawn in, and the smallest trace of gratitude had flickered across her mind. The inside of the carriage had then caught her attention. Eyes wide with astonishment, she had taken in the luxurious surroundings. It had been marveled by her that such elegance could be contained within a mere carriage. Though her father had once been known for extravagance and opulence, riding in carriages adorned with gold and fine silks, even those could not compare to what now lay before her. This vehicle had been crafted with unmatched care. Every inch had been detailed, polished, and elegant. The impression that had come to her mind was that of a rolling treasure chest, ornate, mysterious, and rich with secrets. As she had tried to shift herself within the pocket, a sudden movement had caused her to slip slightly. Her balance had faltered, and it had seemed as though she would fall, but Kendrick's hand had moved swiftly to catch her before any harm could befall her. In that moment, as she had stared up at him from within the safety of his hand, a chilling thought had taken root within her. The man before her, whose pocket had just been admired, was no gentle giant. He was a wolf, a predator capable of ending her life with a single motion. A creature of instinct, strength, and dominance. And yet, it had been hoped by her that she would remain unharmed. A belief had settled in her heart that Kendrick would not hurt her, not while arson still needed to be treated. Despite this hope, her instincts had continued to scream at her, warning her to flee while the opportunity remained. It had been remembered by her that this same man, in her past life, had played a part in the downfall of her family. The pain of that truth had weighed heavily on her, and her feathers had begun to tremble visibly. Her wings had shifted, betraying her desire to escape. This movement had not gone unnoticed by Kendrick, who had commented, with curiosity in his tone, that perhaps the urge to take flight was being felt by her. The question had not been directly asked, but the implication had been clear. Internally, Lyncher had responded with denial. That was not her intention, or so she had told herself. Further misunderstanding had followed when Kendrick had remarked, rather sternly, that the carriage had not been intended as a place for relieving oneself. The implication had been deeply embarrassing, and the reaction in Lyncher's mind had been one of sheer horror. The very idea had been rejected with vehemence. Absolutely not, she had thought. How frustrating this situation is. After a while, it had been mentioned by Kendrick that they had traveled far enough from Rhaenyra. A suggestion had been offered, perhaps it was now safe enough to speak freely. He had encouraged her to transform, stating that no threat would reach her here. His words had been appreciated by Lyncher, for the desire to return to her human form had been felt for quite some time. Yet, when the attempt had been made, no change had occurred. Her feathers had remained. Her form had not shifted. She had shaken her head slowly in frustration. Her body had refused to respond to her will. This inability to transform had been noticed by Kendrick. It had been asked by him, gently, whether the transformation could not be undone. Upon receiving confirmation, though no words had been spoken, he had sighed and admitted that the situation had become more complicated. However, the journey had been resumed. It had been stated that she would be taken to the mansion as planned. A reassurance had been given that if her decision changed at any point, her return would be arranged without question. But the idea of returning had been instantly rejected by Lyncher. That chapter of her life, in her mind, had been closed forever. As the carriage moved forward, Lyncher had perched herself on Kendrick's shoulder, her small body rising and falling with each breath. She had wondered how long the journey to Eckhart would take. Though she had never been to the region herself, it had been heard that Eckhart and Rhaenyra shared a border which had often been the source of tension between their tribes. Territorial disputes, particularly over control of the Hampton River, had often ignited skirmishes and animosity. It had been understood by Lyncher that this river, flowing through the heart of the disputed lands, held great strategic and political value. But now, none of that had seemed to matter to her. Her only concern had been escape. At last, she had thought. The Rhaenyra name is being left behind. After some time, the carriage had arrived at the gates of the Eckhart mansion. As Lyncher glanced out, her eyes had widened with awe. The estate had been magnificent, grander than she had imagined. Ornamental fountains had sparkled in the sun, while towering stone structures loomed proudly in the distance. Beauty and strength had blended seamlessly in the design of the mansion. Before she could gather her thoughts, Kendrick had reminded her, softly, that she ought to hold on tightly so that no further mishaps would occur. Inwardly, Lyncher had reassured herself that no mistakes would be repeated. The chaos of their first encounter had been learned from. Yet, just as comfort had begun to settle in, a harsh voice had pierced the air. A wolf had appeared, his expression twisted in fury, his eyes locked on them with unmistakable hostility. The serenity of their arrival had been shattered in an instant. And once again, Lyncher had been reminded, safety, for her, would never come easily. The Beloved, Chapter 6. Even while remaining trapped in her bird form, Lyncher had been alert and thoughtful, her small eyes scanning the surroundings with caution. It had been when her gaze landed on a figure crouched in the distance, a large, ragged wolf, that unease had begun to settle within her. At first, it had simply been assumed by her that it was a wild wolf, a common enough sight in unfamiliar forests. But something about it had felt off. Its posture had not matched what she had read in books about wolves. The creature had been breathing far too heavily, its chest rising and falling in strained movements, and its eyes, those eyes, had appeared unhinged, filled with terror and fury, as if its very mind had been lost. This behavior had triggered something in Lyncher's memory. It had been recalled by her that once, long ago, a passage had been read in a book about a peculiar flower that grew in scattered, remote areas, an ominous bloom whose scent was believed to drive animals into a frenzied madness. According to that text, when animals inhaled the aroma, their rational minds would be clouded, leaving only their base instincts to guide them. The possibility had chilled her, had this wolf perhaps crossed paths with such a flower? If that were the case, then danger was much closer than she had initially realized. Fear had taken root in her tiny frame. It had been thought by her, in that trembling moment, that if the beast lost complete control and lunged, a creature of her size, a mere bird, would stand no chance. A single bite would be enough to end her. Panic had begun to rise. Her heart had raced, wings twitching ever so slightly under the weight of dread. However, it had not gone unnoticed. The wolf's behavior had clearly drawn the attention of Kendrick, who had been walking beside her. A protective gesture had been made by him, as his hand had been raised gently in front of her, placing himself between Lyncher and the agitated beast. Words had then been spoken to the wolf, firm and commanding. The creature, now identified as Dagon, had been told that his behavior had become inappropriate and disrespectful. From Lyncher's side, confusion had arisen. Thoughts had been racing through her mind. It had not been expected by her that Kendrick, a member of the wolf clan, could command wild wolves. Questions had begun to form: was he capable of controlling even beasts twisted by madness? Or perhaps this was no ordinary wolf. Suddenly, the creature's form had begun to change. Fur and claws had melted away, replaced by skin and limbs. Before long, a man had stood where the wild beast had once been. Lyncher had watched in astonishment as the transformation had completed itself. The man, still breathing heavily, had looked at Kendrick, his expression equal parts confusion and concern. It had been demanded by him why Kendrick had returned with a bird when the expectation had only been for brief negotiations with the Bird Clan. Kendrick had explained, without hesitation, that the girl had been picked up from Rhaenyra. A sharp question had followed. It had been asked whether she had simply been handed over by the clan that easily. The answer had been a flat denial. It had been clarified by Kendrick that she had not been handed over, but instead, she had been picked up, found and brought along. This revelation had struck Lyncher deeply. The memory of begging him to take her to Eckhart had returned to her. From the way Dagon had reacted, it had become clear that even the Wolf clan had not expected her presence. Her arrival, it seemed, had come as a surprise even to them. As Kendrick had walked forward with Lyncher still resting on his shoulder, the tall gates of the Eckhart Palace had been opened. Awaiting him had been a sizable group of servants and attendants, all standing in disciplined rows.
This entry is our main character's new beginning in Wolf Mansion. Let's see where her journey will go from now on. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.